The bride had a wooden leg she'd carved herself. A carpenter spent 3 months crafting her a better one. The first thing I noticed wasn't the leg. It was the calluses on her right hand, thick as harness leather, in a place a woman's hand has no business growing calluses unless she's been doing a man's whittling for years. She was standing on the platform at Spalding with a carpetbag in that hand and a cane in the other, and the train was already pulling off behind her in a wall of cinder smoke, and she looked at me the way you look at a horse you're not sure you want to buy. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's how it goes when I tell this. I built things for 40 years, and I never built one in a straight line, so why would I tell it that way? Her name was Esther Voss, and she'd written 4 letters to me before she ever set foot off that train, and not one of them mentioned the leg. I don't hold that against her now. I've turned it over enough nights since to understand a woman doesn't put a thing like that in a letter to a stranger, doesn't want to be turned down by mail, wants at least the dignity of being turned down to her face if it comes to that. I understand it. At the time, I stood there on the platform with my hat in my hands like a fool, and didn't say one word for what felt like an hour, but was probably 6 seconds. She broke it first. I lost it below the knee, wagon wheel 11 years back. I carved this one myself out of a fence post because the doctor in Abilene wanted $40 and I had 4. She said it flat, no shake in it, like she was reading off a list of supplies. If that changes your mind, you can put me back on the 415 and I'll understand it. I want to tell you I said something fine right then. I didn't. I picked up her carpetbag and said, "Wagons this way," and that was the whole of it. My place sat 2 miles out from town, a house I'd built with my own hands the way I built everything, slow and square and true, because that's the only way I know how to do a thing. I was 43 years old and I'd never married. There'd been a woman once, back in Missouri, before the war took my brother and put a different kind of silence in our house. But that's its own story and not this one. I came west and I made furniture and coffins and gun stocks and whatever the town needed made of wood, and I got a reputation for it. The kind of reputation where men nod at you and don't ask you to supper. Steady. Reliable. Not much for talk. A man people trust with their lumber and don't think twice about beyond that. Esther's peg leg was rough work. I saw that the second night when she sat by the stove with her skirt hiked enough to unstrap it and clean the stump, not hiding it from me, not flaunting it either, just doing what needed doing the way she did everything. The wood was raw pine, unfinished, the socket lined with a folded wool sock gone thin as paper. The hinge at what would have been the ankle was a strap of harness leather and 2 nails, and I could see where it had rubbed her raw in 3 places, scabbed over more than once. I didn't say anything that night either. But I lay awake a long while looking at the ceiling I'd built, thinking about grain and balance, and how a man fits a thing to a body so it carries weight without biting. We were married inside 2 weeks, by the circuit preacher, in my front room with Mrs. Holt from the Mercantile as the only witness because Esther didn't know another soul in the county, and I'd never made the kind of friends you invite to a wedding. She wore a gray dress she'd brought folded in the carpetbag. She didn't cry, I didn't either. We shook hands after, if you can believe that, like we'd closed on a piece of land. It wasn't until the 3rd week that I started on the leg. I didn't tell her I was doing it. I went out to the shop after supper after she'd banked the stove and gone to read by the lamp, and I started taking her old peg apart in my head before I ever touched a tool, the way I always work a thing out before I cut. I needed to know how she walked, where her weight fell, whether she favored the hip or the knee, how long her stride ran compared to a natural leg. So for 2 weeks I just watched her. Not staring. A man can watch without staring if he's done it as long as I have, watching grain in a board, watching how water moves before he builds a flume. She caught me at it the 2nd week. "You're studying me," she said, not unkind, just plain, the way she said everything. "I'm studying how you walk." "Why?" I didn't have a good answer ready, so I gave her the true one. "Because the leg you've got is wrong for you, and I aim to fix that." She went quiet a long moment, and her jaw set the way I'd come to know meant she was deciding whether to let herself want a thing. "I made that leg myself," she said, "out of a fence post, with a hatchet and a borrowed rasp." "I know it, it's good work for a fence post and a hatchet. I've got better tools." She didn't thank me, she didn't say go ahead. She just nodded once short and went back to her book, and I took that for what it was, which was more than a yes from a woman like her. I want you to understand what 3 months of evenings looks like when you're building one leg. It isn't 3 months of steady work. It's a piece carved and fitted and rejected, carved again. I went through 4 blocks of black walnut before I found the grain I wanted, dense enough to bear weight, light enough she wouldn't drag it by sundown. I carved the socket to the exact shape of her stump, which meant I had to measure her stump, which meant the two of us sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with a length of string and a stub of pencil while I marked her skin like I was marking a board, and neither one of us said much. But I felt her watching my hands the whole time the way I'd been watching her walk. I built the ankle joint out of brass fittings I ordered special from Wichita, a real hinge, not leather and nails, something that would flex instead of just swing. I lined the socket in lamb's wool I bought off a rancher 2 towns over and traded a gun cabinet for. I carved the foot itself to match the boot she favored, built up the heel so her stride would even out and her hip would quit aching by Sunday the way I'd noticed it did. She asked me once, maybe 6 weeks in, why I was taking such pains over it. I had walnut shavings in my hair and a chisel in my hand, and I didn't look up right away. Because you carved your own out of a fence post with a hatchet and never once asked anybody for help, I said. And I figure a woman who'll do that for herself deserves to have somebody do it right for her, just the one time. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't leave the shop either. She sat on the stool by the window and read while I worked, most evenings after that, and I won't pretend that wasn't its own kind of courting, the two of us quiet in a room with wood shavings curling up off the floor and the lamp burning low. There was a night in the 2nd month I should tell you about. A storm came through, hard rain, and the roof of the shop had a leak I'd been meaning to patch for a year, and water started coming down right over my bench where the new leg sat half-finished, the walnut still raw and unsealed. I came up off my chair so fast I knocked it over, and Esther was already there ahead of me, already had her shawl off and thrown over the wood before I even got my hands on it, soaking the rain into wool instead of letting it touch the grain. We stood there in the dark with the lamp guttering and her shawl ruined and the leg dry underneath it, and she looked up at me with rain in her hair and said, "Well, don't just stand there. Help me wring this out before it warps." I want to tell you that's when I knew. But the truth is I'd known longer than that and just hadn't let myself say it, the way a man will sand a joint smooth and smooth and smooth past the point it needs it because he's not ready to call the piece finished. I finished the leg on a Tuesday in October. I remember it was a Tuesday because that was bread day and the house smelled like it. I'd kept the whole thing covered with a feed sack those last 2 weeks so she wouldn't see it before it was done. And that evening, I carried it into the front room wrapped in a piece of canvas and set it on the table between us like I was laying down a deed to something. She unwrapped it slow, didn't say a word the whole time. Black walnut rubbed to a deep shine with linseed oil, the brass hinge gleaming, the socket lined soft as a glove, the foot shaped and finished to match her good boot so close you'd have to look twice walking down the street to tell which leg was which. She ran her hand down the length of it the way you'd run a hand down a horse's neck, checking it, trusting it. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes were wet, which I had not seen from her before, not at the wedding, not once. "Nobody ever," she said, and stopped and started again. "Nobody ever built a thing for me before. I built things for myself my whole life because there wasn't anybody else to do it." "I know it," I said. "That's why I did." She strapped it on right there at the table, stood up careful, took a few steps across the floorboards I'd laid myself 5 years back, and I watched her walk the way I'd watched her walk for 2 months running, except now there was no hitch in it, no favor in the hip, nothing dragging. She walked like a woman who'd never lost a thing in her life, and she stopped in the middle of the room and just stood there a second, getting used to standing even. Then she crossed back to where I was and put her hand flat on my chest, right over my shirt buttons, and left it there. "You're not the kind of man who says much," she said. "I noticed that the first day, figured you for cold maybe, I was wrong about that." "I'm not cold," I said. "I just say it with my hands instead of my mouth, always have." She didn't laugh, but something in her face came loose, easy the way a board comes loose once you found the grain and stopped fighting it. She stood up on the new leg, balanced steady as anybody, and put her other hand up alongside the first, both palms flat against me, and she didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. I'd spent 3 months saying it in walnut and brass and lamb's wool, one cut at a time, and she'd understood every word of it. We're 19 years married now. The leg I built her that October still holds, though I've replaced the hinge twice and resoled the foot more times than I can count, And every time I do it, she sits on that same stool by the shop window with a book in her lap and watches my hands the way she did the first time, and neither one of us says much, and neither one of us needs to. Some men get told they're loved. I got shown it, the same way I showed her with my hands in the quiet over time. That's the only kind of telling I ever trusted anyway.